The Innkeeper by Life Sketcher. Chapter 461 Golden Key. But like I said, the true cause and effects of the matter are being investigated, the Henali said. A very serious look adorned its black, rectangular face. Only 6 of its 26 eyes were on its face, framed right above a mouth filled with rows of sharp teeth, while the rest of its eyes were hidden across its body. Its face was attached to its body through a short, thin neck. The body itself was massive, with a majority of its scales hidden behind the soft cloth robe it had adorned. 8 legs kept it standing, with 2 sets of 4 legs protruding from the left and right of its torso. A tail, much longer and thicker than the width of its legs, came out from the back of its robe and hung directly over the Henali, making it look like an oversized scorpion without the actual pincers. But, regardless of what the result of the investigation may be, it can be confirmed that as of now, the attack on RA does not seem to have resulted in any long-term adverse effects on the origin realm. In fact, due to the rich nature of the energy that was dispersed into the realm, it has even sped up the growth of the realm. Preliminary investigations reveal that the realm may mature billions of years ahead of schedule. So does that mean there will be no punishment? Asked a random downlord. Instead, it sounds like there should be a prize for speeding up the maturing process. The remainder of the Henali assembly awaited the response. It was a rule that downlords could not casually release their might in the origin realm, or else they would be punished by the Henali. Even if they had to fight, they would have to ensure that their strength would not adversely affect the realm. After all, the origin realm was still not capable of handling the might of downlords, since it technically wasn't capable of giving birth to any downlords. All the downlords in this realm were either guests from other realms, or had their strength raised artificially through special means. No, regardless of whether the result was good or bad, there will definitely be a punishment. It is just yet to be decided if the one receiving the punishment should be RA, or the one responsible for the attack. We allow downlords into our realm so that they can benefit from an immature realm, in exchange for a small fee dash. Someone at the assembly scoffed at the mention of the fee being small. But that does not mean we can allow them to interfere with its natural progression. Once might be a lucky event, and if it is let go, it will only encourage others to try the same. In the long run dash. The Henali that was speaking paused when another being suddenly teleported inside the assembly. The Henali assembly was held in a special arena, cut off from the rest of the origin realm. It was an extremely secure location under the control of the Henali, which allowed them to host many prestigious guests, the various downlords being amongst them. But the secure nature of the location meant that no one could teleport in or out once the session was called into motion, unless it was an emergency. This assembly had already been interrupted once, an almost unprecedented feat, so that information about the attack on RA could be shared amongst those attending. This second interruption was genuinely unprecedented in the history of the origin realm. As soon as the teleportation was finished, another Henali appeared, seemingly perfectly identical to the first. It was a common trait amongst Henali. Those not of the race would have a difficult time distinguishing amongst them based solely on appearance. Someone is resonating with the laws of the realm, the newcomer announced loudly. What do you mean? The convener of the assembly asked, bewildered by the statement. I mean exactly what I said. Someone, or something is having a breakthrough, and that breakthrough is resonating with the laws of the entire realm. But that's impossible. The realm is not mature enough to birth a downlord, the convener exclaimed. I am not here to argue with you, I am only here to tell you what's happening. The resonance can be felt throughout the entire realm. Its repercussions cannot be predicted. Attempts to divine the identity of the entity responsible are being blocked. Whoever is doing this has destiny-level protection to keep them from being divined, which means they've obviously been planning this for eons. Silence fell across the hall as everyone tried to guess what this meant. Everyone wondered what the identity of the person responsible was. Even Balaam was unsure if he should attribute this latest development to the Innkeeper, for it was just too bizarre. Only one thing was certain. If the being responsible for this was a Fugan, this could be the build-up for a full-on realm war. Back at the Midnight Inn, the few guests who had recovered, and the new guests who had arrived at the inn, all were looking up at the sky in awe. There was no sun, no clouds, no sky, only a golden hue that stretched as far as the eye could see. If it was just a matter of different lighting, everyone may not have been so captivated by it. Instead, the golden hue radiated a majestic aura that not only overwhelmed anyone and everyone exposed to it, it made them feel oddly connected to it, as if the aura had come from within them, but at the same time was something that endlessly surpassed them. Truth be told, the guests who were exposed, one and all, could not fully comprehend the majesty of the aura, for it far surpassed what their minds were capable of comprehending. Outside the inn, in the rest of the origin realm, however, there were many who could make a few guesses, but even they only saw an obscure golden hue. After all, no matter how much they stretched their spiritual senses, they were too close to it to see the full image. It would take someone to look at the entire origin realm all at once to notice that the hue that had enveloped the entire realm was actually in the shape of a golden key. Chapter 462 Affinities. Unlike energy, which had to travel from one point to another, laws existed everywhere all at once. They were all also irrevocably linked, and reacted to one another. It was impossible to isolate a law, or the effects and presence of a law from other laws. For example, the law of gravity could not be isolated from the law of time, or the law of heat, or even a seemingly mundane law such as the law of procrastination which, make no mistake, was a law written in and ingrained into the very fabric of the origin realm. But while this was so, the complexities and intricacies of laws far surpassed something that could be explained or comprehended using simple vocabulary. As such, whether it was the Henali, the Downlords, the gods, the oracles, the system wielders, the gifted, or even the sovereigns, none could comprehend the golden hue that had lit up the realm. Of course, given enough time, maybe it was possible. But even that was a maybe. For the golden hue was not made up of a single law, nor did it interact with only one law. It was catalyzing something within the existing laws of the realm that could not be detected so easily, prompting even the Henali to request aid from their home realm, a realm that had truly matured and had existed for far longer than the origin realm. But the change in laws was only the most direct change the realm suffered due to the golden hue. There were so many other side effects of it, the least of which was that all the places in the realm which had never seen light were now illuminated. Under the golden light of the laws, as well as the aura it radiated, many ancient beings that had long entered slumber awoke, or began to wake up. Many secrets that were hidden in the darkness came to light, and many undiscovered regions presented themselves for all to see. The longer the hue existed, the more drastic its effects were becoming. But Lex had no knowledge of any of this. He was too preoccupied with his evolving body. His golden core was destined to be more complex than a simple one just due to the fact that it was formed not only due to his spirit cultivation, but his body and soul as well. Ironically, while one would have expected the changes to make the core bigger, it was actually much smaller than most normal cores. Yet its small size did not make it weaker. On the contrary, it stored the same amount of energy it would have anyway, but due to its smaller size, made the energy much more concentrated and thus elevated it to a higher level. As the process of the formation of his core continued, Lex was simultaneously also experiencing another, innate part of every breakthrough, which was that he was being elevated to a higher life form. The natural hierarchy of his existence in the universe was being raised, for he could now come into contact with a higher level of the universe. A part of this elevation was his existence being allowed to convert natural spirit energy into one with his own affinity. For Lex, a wielder of regal embrace, the affinity he would have normally attained would have been called regal affinity, according to the cultivation technique itself. Yet it was at this time that a change occurred that was outside the bounds of control of his cultivation technique. Due to the dedicated hard work of the lotus on Lex's back and all the precious materials that were fused into him, his body had gained the ability to physically tolerate, and to some degree influence laws. Since his golden core was forming from his body, it too gained this attribute. But it was this additional attribute that caused a divergence in the subsequent result. The energy within Lex's body did not gain regal affinity, but a fusion of the affinity of the cultivation technique regal embrace, as well as Lex's newly gained affinity for laws. This was something that was not supposed to happen. In the very beginning, when Lex underwent the 4 stages of alteration so that he could cultivate regal embrace, his body was purged of any and all affinities it may have inherently had, all in preparation for the breakthrough he was going through at the moment. But the cultivation technique did not account for the fact that Lex would have access to something as inconceivably rare as the world seed lotus rite in his body, which could easily make additions to his body without causing any harm whatsoever. The new, unnamed affinity did not in any way impair Lex's breakthrough. In fact, once the golden core was formed, and his body stopped absorbing the laws, undergoing a change within the in, resulting in the golden hue finally fading, Lex's breakthrough continued in a smooth fashion. Once the golden core was formed, the vortex of spirit energy around Lex lessened, but did not entirely disappear. For a few more hours, it continued to pour spirit energy into Lex's body, allowing it to upgrade as well so that it could reach a level where it could tolerate his new spirit energy. Besides the body, it also enhanced Lex's spirit and his soul. A feeling Lex could not accurately describe filled him. It was as if, before this, he had existed merely as a wisp, as something that could easily be blown out of existence. Yet now, he had changed from a wisp into something concrete, something firm and durable. He also felt another strange sensation. Normally, after one of his breakthroughs, Lex could physically feel himself become much tougher, as if his defense and survivability had increased several folds. Now, however, he was feeling like, it did not matter how immeasurably durable his defense was, for there was nothing strong enough to challenge it to begin with. He did not feel he had grown stronger. Instead, it felt like the universe around him had become mundane. Occasionally missing content, please report errors in time. Chapter 463 New Abilities. The absurd feelings that enveloped Lex did not last long, and as his body slowly stabilized, they dissipated. After all, how could Lex be arrogant enough to feel that the universe was mundane? But that was not to say that Lex did not feel himself filled with awesome power. He truly felt as if he had surpassed what it meant to be human. The urge of common protagonists to punch a random rock to test out his strength filled him, but there were no rocks available in his meditation room. That could be fixed easily. He summoned a massive, 20 feet, 6 meters, large boulder and placed it right in front of himself. Before acting cool and actually punching it, Lex rubbed his hand on it, to feel the cold firm surface. But, things did not go according to plan. As easily as if he was running his hand through running water, his fingers dipped into the rock, causing massive cracks to form across the boulder's surface. He froze, before he tried again. This time, holding out his index finger, he pressed directly into the boulder. There was a brief moment of resistance, before his finger started digging into the rock in a smooth manner. It was as if Lex was poking a hole in a cake instead of a rock. Cracks spread deeper and wider along the surface of the rock as he pushed his finger in. When his finger had dug in all the way, and his fist touched the surface, Lex continued to push, and it continued to go in as easily. A single loud crack resonated in the room as the boulder was split into two, with the sides falling to the left and right side respectively. Lex remained standing still as he tried to grasp his mind around what he had just done, but there was no time for him to calmly gather his thoughts. He had taken a major step along the cultivation pathway, and had evolved into a higher being. How could something as paltry as brute strength be all he gained? As he was looking at the boulder, his mind still taken aback by his strength, the first of his new abilities revealed itself. His spirit sense emerged from his body and completely wrapped itself around the boulder, so that he was not only looking at it with his eyes, he was observing every fiber of it with his senses. Every single groove in the rock, every layer in the minerals that composed the rock itself, every shade and pattern, every crack and fissure, all revealed themselves to Lex within his mind. For a moment he was startled, thinking it was too much information, before he once again froze. No, it wasn't. The degree of detail with which his spirit sense was feeding him information was immeasurably beyond anything Lex could have withstood before. Having so much information actively in his thoughts all at the same time would have caused him to nearly collapse. His brain would have been working in overdrive, his blood pumping like he was running a marathon, and his spirit energy draining as if through an open faucet to support his mind containing so much information all at the same time. Yet now, he barely felt the amount of detail worthy of notice. A thought ran through his mind wondering just how complex an array he could create now that his mind was capable of holding so much more information. But it was only a fleeting thought, as his current focus was on his spirit sense. He had no idea how to control it. It was as if a new limb suddenly appeared on his body, and while it reacted to his subconscious thoughts, consciously he did not know how to maneuver it. Moreover, from his research, Lex knew that spirit senses could do a lot more than just allow Lex to observe things. It could be used to physically manipulate items as a funnel, to channel his energy, to communicate with others secretly, and more. He just had to figure out how to do all that. For now, though, he settled on gaining a better understanding of the observation ability his spirit sense allowed. He continued to observe the boulder wrapped in his spirit sense and began taking in the various details. That's when he noticed the anomaly. The information he was receiving from his sight, and the information he was receiving from his spirit sense should have provided him with two different streams of information to parse through, but when he actually paid attention, there seemed to be one more. At first this confused Lex, especially since he was having a difficult time adjusting to having so much information directly streamed into his brain that he could essentially see the item wrapped in his senses. Except, this vision did not come from a single direction, such as a person observing something from a particular angle, but was all-encompassing. The fact that he was not overwhelmed by it was also messing with his thought process. He was just not used to the new capacity his brain allowed. But then, as if responding to his concern, his brain automatically filtered the information from the different sources into separate categories so that he knew what information he was sensing and what he was seeing. It was then that he realized that his vision seemed to be providing him with two different feedbacks. One was looking at everything at surface value, the way normal vision worked, and the other was looking at something more ethereal. He closed his left eye and discovered that the ethereal vision disappeared, leaving only the boulder in his sight. Then he reopened the left and closed the right, and finally figured out the source of the extra information. The only problem was, he could not understand what he was seeing. He saw a boulder, but somehow he also saw through it. He saw everything that made it up, and saw the possibilities of how it could interact with its surroundings. He was reading how the rock would behave, react, exist, disappear, and be destroyed in various conditions. It was as if he was reading the rock's personality, if that was possible. For reasons he couldn't understand, his left eye was feeding him even more information than his spirit senses. Occasionally missing content, please report errors in time. Chapter 464, Good News, Bad News. A few hours after the golden hue had disappeared, most of the guests had already completed their breakthroughs and the festival had resumed. Though, the guests seemed more focused on just partying and celebrating than participating in any random activities. This was good, because the next major activity would also be a week later. Even most of the tournaments had ended, as it was expected that this week would be spent in a meditative retreat for anyone who had breakthroughs from one realm to another. In fact, the only reason a majority of the guests had even finished their cultivation was because they were at the foundation realm or even below. In that case, while a retreat was needed, it did not take as long. Moreover, once they regained basic control of their bodies and spirit, they could space out their cultivation retreats over a period of time. Keeping all this in mind, the jubilant mood at the inn could be understood extremely well. Of course, there was a small portion of guests who were equally depressed at having missed out on such a great opportunity, and some were even angry at the inn for not giving a longer warning period. After all, a couple of weeks truly was too short a notice period. This is the kind of thing people plan months or even years in advance, depending on the cultivation level. Among these crowds, there were a pair of young, human siblings who were completely overwhelmed. Plot Device, as the brother was called, had to do his utmost to keep his tears from falling out, while the sister, called Plot Device too, did not hesitate at all to let her tears flow. Their lives had been too miserable, so much so that they could not believe the wonderful thing that was happening to them. The feeling of relief and joy, it was so rare in their life that they did not know how to express it. The boy of age 13 and the girl of age 11 had both been born with terrible birth defects that not only kept them in constant pain, but would have prevented them from cultivating when they came of age. If they could not cultivate, they had no chance of ever improving their lives. After all, their parents were long dead in the war. They too would have been destined for death in the recent raids, had they not been saved by, she could only be described as an angel, a holy woman or a saint. Who else would help them? Then, as if they were being rewarded for a lifetime of bad luck, not only were they saved by her, they had been brought to this and via something known as the pro bono room. Before they could understand what was happening, a strange change occurred, after which they got extremely sick and fell unconscious. Yet when they woke up, not only was the pain gone, so were all the defects. Was this heaven? It must be. First, they were blessed by an angel, and then brought directly to heaven. Unfortunately, this was not heaven, and they could not stay forever. They disappeared, returning to the tent where they had been living previously. Fear filled their heart, as they felt they were about to wake from a good dream. But no such thing happened. The pain continued to elude them. The flap to the tent opened, and the angelic saint woman appeared once again, though if anyone else saw her, they might not agree. She did not have hair of flowing gold, for it had been tied and hidden behind her helmet, nor did she have skin as fair as the pure snow, for it was covered in dirt and sweat and grime. She wore leather armor and not a summer dress, and the air about her was hot and full of battle lust, not delicate and petite. What happened? Where did you go? She asked, suppressing the concern in her voice. We went to this magical place called the Midnight Inn, the sister began. She did not notice the look of recognition that passed through the woman's eyes. The Midnight Inn. She had been there too, once or twice. As she listened more to the children's story, she realized that she had missed out on a great opportunity. She should pay more attention to it in the future. Over the next few hours, Lex tried to learn how to control his spirit sense. It should not have been so difficult. After all, how hard could it be to manipulate an invisible sense inherently linked to his spirit that could channel information directly to him, and pass through physical objects like they were nothing? Well, the answer was it was pretty hard. But that was not all. His body was still undergoing the stabilization process from his breakthrough, and the more time he spent, the more new abilities he discovered. Like spirit sense, he also unlocked something called soul sense, as well as an advanced version of the instincts his body afforded him called intuition. They both were incredibly powerful and diverse, and drastically increased the number of things Lex could do. But, unfortunately, there was still more awaiting him. When his body finally completely stabilized, he underwent a familiar rush of information from his cultivation technique. Every time he had a major breakthrough, he would receive information from Regal Embrace about his new realm, what it was normally and how he was different, and what he should do to progress further. This time, though, he got a lot more information than ever before. As if it were a sentient thing, the technique imparted to him the various details of the effects that each realm had on him, and how they were inevitably linked to the needs of his breakthrough in subsequent realms. One of the major factors, unsurprisingly, was stability. His cultivation was focused on extreme stability, so as to continuously perfect his defense without eliciting any adverse reactions. Similarly, his regal affinity was supposed to do the same for his future breakthroughs. However, Lex achieved something that should have never happened, and his energy took on an unknown affinity. As such, should he attempt to break through to the nascent realm in the future, there was a 99.99% chance that he would explode and die. Occasionally missing content, please report errors in time. Chapter 465 Calm. Confusion clouded Lex's mind as he repeatedly went over the information provided by his cultivation technique. The regal affinity was supposed to make spirit energy extremely resilient, meaning its affinity would not be easily overridden and induced stability in whatever it affects. This was supposed to be the bedrock of Lex's breakthrough when he entered the nascent realm. This was due to the fact that, normally, when humans cultivate, nascent is the realm in which their soul finally becomes strong enough and gains the ability to exist without the body. The realm was more complicated than just that, and included many things beyond the simple strengthening of the soul, but in context to Lex, it was a huge issue. After all, another ability of nascent was to separate the soul from the body according to need, but Lex technically did not have an independent soul anymore. Thus, since this was the cultivation path that Lex was following, adjustments needed to be made to assure that the breakthrough wouldn't try to separate Lex's soul forcefully, thereby destroying him, since his soul and body were the same now. The stable nature of regal affinity would have played a key role in stabilizing his body, while the natural process of the breakthrough tried to do the exact opposite. The very fact that Lex's affinity had changed, regardless of whatever effects his new affinity had, jeopardized his breakthrough, making it likely that he would fail and die. Moreover, this was not a one-time issue that needed to be dealt with only once. Even if Lex found some external assistance in helping to stabilize his body during the breakthrough, the reliance on the nature of regal affinity was repeated in many more aspects of the cultivation technique from there on. What that basically meant was that even if, using external factors, he did break through without dying, meaning availing that 0.01% chance of survival, he would become crippled and unable to actually use his cultivation due to conflicts his affinity created. Once the confusion elapsed, panic set in. How could this be? No, this wasn't supposed to happen? What will he do now? What? Lex suddenly closed his eyes and drew in a deep breath. While holding his breath in, Lex clenched his fists tightly and strained all the muscles in his body while standing still. For a few minutes, he stayed like that, before he slowly started letting the air escape his lungs. One by one, he relaxed his muscles, and once he was done, unclenched his fists. When Lex reopened his eyes, there was no panic or confusion in them any longer. There was only calm. It was not even confidence, for how could he be confident in tackling a matter that far surpassed his understanding? But he was definitely calm. He had traveled the universe, walked out of hordes of zombies, bathed in lava, killed countless strong enemies, hosted rulers of entire empires and races at his inn. He was Lex. It was not so easy to overwhelm him anymore. Facing this great, seemingly impossible task, Lex set out to think of a solution. But before that, he had to adjust his state perfectly. After a very, very long time, Lex put on the bathroom set, which included the bathrobe, bathroom slippers, and the bathroom towel. Individually, all these had various effects, but when worn together, they had a set effect which basically cleansed him internally and externally of all hazardous factors and let him focus on the task at hand. The reason he put this on now was because internal factors also included things such as doubt, anxiety, inner demons, etc. He could have no distractions during this time. He could not afford to make a mistake regarding such a sensitive issue. He reviewed all the available information that he had from the very beginning. First, regal embrace was a unique cultivation technique, meaning that no one else in the universe had ever practiced it before, nor would they ever do so again. That was not a part of the cultivation technique's description, but a requirement of his reward back then. He recalled that the regal embrace was a part of someone's collection. A certain being somewhere in the universe had it. He had not thought about it again since then, but the insinuation of that information was great. If there was a cultivation technique that blatantly said it had the strongest defense in the entire universe, yet the owner only kept it as a part of his collection, then what did the owner cultivate? In fact, now that he was recalling the matter, even Mo's blessing, which was described as having the strongest attack in the universe, was also a part of a being's collection. There existed the possibility that these were two different beings, but Lex thought it was unlikely. Regardless of whatever the being in question cultivated, the fact that it existed in his collection, and was not generated by the system gave Lex a lot of assurance. That did not mean that he was aiming to search for that being. It just meant that someone somewhere had designed these two cultivation techniques. If there were beings capable of designing his cultivation technique, there were surely beings capable of altering it as well to help him. Moreover, with the Midnight Inn, he was uniquely equipped to search the entire universe for those skilled in created cultivation techniques. Come to think of it, John himself created spiritual techniques based on his customers' requests. Lex wondered if his system was some kind of academic system, capable of designing techniques. It seemed he would have to put questioning John on his agenda. Focusing back on the matter at hand, Lex identified a few key things he had to do now. First of all, while he could not break through the realm, he was free to grow within the Golden Core realm, so he would do that. Next, Lex would begin doing research into cultivation techniques and how they were designed. Other than that, he would also have to begin doing research on people or entities skilled in creating or altering cultivation techniques. How he would ensure their trust once he found someone potentially skilled enough was also an issue he would have to look into. These were the key things in regards to focusing on regaining his cultivation path. Other than these, Lex also had to spend some time familiarizing himself with his new abilities. While Regal Embrace gave a brief description of what Soul Sense did, Lex did not understand it completely. Intuition, on the other hand, had it in its very nature to allow Lex to understand completely what it did. Yes, soul and spirit senses were extremely cool. In fact, technically speaking, all three abilities were probably different but equal in their potential. But damn was intuition impressive. Lex already knew it would be his favorite. It was a much more advanced version of the instincts he had already been using, except that he could freely direct it towards whatever he wanted. Moreover, it made him extremely sensitive to anything at all that had to do with him. If he was sitting in a room of 1,000 people, and a single one of them thought of Lex's name, his intuition would be able to detect it. The range of his ability was limited, for now, but in all things related to Lex, his intuition was going to play a huge role. Primary Realm, Gaia's Graveyard. In the center of this zone, which was acknowledged as the largest death zone in the entire universe by some, was a cozy little wooden hut. Well, it was not wood but the flesh of Gaia, but as the originator of the Tao of wood, it could be considered the same thing. The hut itself did not seem very impressive and had only one bedroom, one library, one vault and one study. Inside the library sat a being whose name had not been uttered in the entire history of this fledgling universe. On his small little sofa, made from the skin of the first ever dragon, on the sofa made from the comfiest leather, the being sat wrapped in a robe that had definitely not been made from the feathers of the divine white heron, drinking from a mug that could most definitely not have been crafted in the flames of a realm that exploded. Beside him sat his pet, a common lynx, and completely not the physical manifestation of a realm that had gained sentience. Yes, all was normal in the library, until the being suddenly frowned in confusion. Someone surpassed the regal heritage? In this universe? How is that even possible? The confusion in his eyes turned to intrigue as his eyes moved as if he was reading something written on air. Ho ho, this is actually interesting, the being said, sitting up. He put his book down and began reading with fervor, but his eyes were only looking at air. Chapter 466 Understanding His Powers. As far as Lex's new abilities were concerned, so long as they were on the list of expected abilities gained in the process of cultivating Regal Embrace, the cultivation technique gave Lex information on them. For intuition, however, even if the cultivation technique failed to provide him with an explanation, he would have known. After all, it was in the nature of the technique itself to provide Lex with information about anything related to himself. For example, currently his intuition was telling him that he should thoroughly master controlling his spirit and soul sense before exiting his room, at least in the guise of the Innkeeper. When Lex's thoughts went to why it was so important he should not appear as the Innkeeper before mastering those abilities, his intuition pointed towards the host attire. While it was not spelling the answer out for him, the hints were big enough. From there Lex could summarize on his own that the host attire only granted him complete control of his facial expressions and his body, but that extreme control he had been relying on to maintain his facade would not extend to these two new senses. Although both the soul and spirit sense were invisible and could not normally be detected, others with spirit and soul senses of their own would be able to detect his if the two touched. At the same time, while Lex was not sure about this, he could venture a guess and say the way emotions such as surprise, anger, happiness, etc. all show up on a person's face, they might show up in the behavior of his senses as well. For example, if he was startled, his senses might tremble and extend out of his body if he didn't keep them sufficiently suppressed. He could guess this much because even the spirit energy within his body reacted in various ways to his emotions, though those reactions were extremely limited since they were contained within his body. That was merely one of the simple effects of his intuition. It was simultaneously warning him of various potential avenues of danger, or rather trouble, he had been ignoring, or not giving enough attention to. The biggest one at the moment was his double identity as Leo. The identity itself was not the problem, but the fact that he wanted to associate that identity with his real identity of Lex, should someone start investigating him. With his name now at the forefront of the guest registry, he needed to strengthen the relation between Leo and Lex by dropping a few subtle hints. Then came the issue of why his name was at the top of the list while so many people stronger than him weren't. That was even simpler to resolve. Lex had been using his own name in the Crystal Realm and the Midnight Tavern, though he had avoided using his last name. He just needed to build a connection between himself there and Leo as well. That way he did not even need to explain his achievement. It would be up to others to use their own imagination about why he appeared in a different realm and what he did there. It wasn't as if these were things he had ignored, but apparently he had just not done enough about them to cover his bases. His intuition would help him avoid simple mistakes like that. The best part was, even this was only a portion of what his intuition could achieve. The ability was truly versatile. So long as it related to his physical body in any way, his intuition would guide him. Up next was his soul sense. The basics of it were easy to understand. In the way that spirit energy could interact with the physical plane of existence, and send Lex feedback so that Lex could essentially see everything his spirit sense touched, the soul sense could do the same, but for the soul plane. A brief description of planes was provided so Lex could understand what they were. Basically all of reality, in every realm across the entire universe, consisted of numerous planes that all existed simultaneously and overlapped one another in the same space, and interacted with one another. Normally, living beings could not differentiate them and so perceived them as a whole. The physical plane was one in which matter existed. The soul plane was another plane in which only souls existed. This concept confused Lex, and not just a little. That was to say, for normal people, their body existed in one plane of existence while their soul existed in another plane of existence altogether? But if they were in different planes, why did the soul need the body's support to exist? For now he just accepted that because the planes could interact with one another, souls could suffer pressure from the physical plane, or maybe some other plane Lex didn't even know about. But this was still something he would look into further. Getting back to his soul sense, if it could show Lex the soul plane, then what did it look like? Nothing. It was a void of darkness, with himself in the center. This was because the soul sense would not detect anything other than souls, and so if Lex only relied on it for sight, in an area like his meditation room where he was the only living being, he would see nothing else. Of course, as these things usually go, even soul sense was not so simple, and people could find ways to hide themselves from his senses, but for the most part, he would be able to sense any soul with his soul sense. That was just the basic feature, and the part that Lex understood. The confusion actually arose when he learned that he could use his soul sense to interact with souls directly, and not only that. When he practiced and got better, he would be able to influence the characteristics of souls to a limited degree, temporarily. According to the description, this would help him in fields such as alchemy, medicine, forging, and many more. It would take time and experimentation for him to understand what that really meant. For now, he closed his eyes and wrapped his own body in his soul sense, which admittedly took longer than Lex had hoped. Still, the result was satisfactory. He could see his own soul, and deep inside it, he could finally see the treasure within which the system was hidden. Occasionally missing content, please report errors in time. Chapter 467, Never Give Up. With his soul sense firmly wrapped around his own body, Lex could see his soul. Only, it looked completely identical to his body. Did that mean his physical body existed on the soul plane? Wait, did that mean he could physically touch souls? A few random thoughts flowed through Lex's brain, but he focused back on the matter at hand. Though his soul looked identical to his body, the difference was he could see through it. But it was not blood or bones he saw, but a small ball of glowing golden light right in his chest. He did not need to wonder what the glowing orb was, for he knew instinctively it was the treasure that contained his system. He did not try anything, for not only was he extremely dependent on the system, for now, he also had very poor control over his soul sense. He did, however, take his time to observe that small glowing ball. Such a small thing had so drastically changed his life. It was hard to imagine. While he was observing it, he also wondered if the reason he could see the system was because it was classified as a soul treasure or if it had a soul of its own. It was not a simple thought, and whichever the answer was would have major insinuations. But, once again, he did not contact Mary to confirm with her. It was pointless. For now, once he was finally done testing out his soul sense, he turned his attention to his other new abilities. These few would require him to figure out the details on his own, for their appearance was not a planned part of regal embrace. His new affinity, whatever it was called, would undoubtedly be extremely significant, for it had not replaced regal affinity, but had fused with it to turn into something else. So, regardless of what effects it had, it would stay on the same scale as the regal affinity, at the very least. Lex could also make a few guesses about what the affinity should be. The lotus had informed him of the changes it had made to his body and what the cause of the issue was. He did not know what laws actually were, but whatever they were, it was obvious that they were far beyond his level. In essence, they were very powerful. Since his affinity had changed due to the changes the lotus had made to his body, he strongly suspected his new affinity would, at least in some regard, have something to do with laws. This was something he'd have to figure out, especially if he wanted to devise a new way to continue to cultivate. As difficult as it would be, all hope was not lost. At least his intuition would be a great help in this regard. But while he could at least speculate about his affinity, he was completely clueless about the changes that happened to his left eye. Even his intuition was silent on why his left eye had gained this new ability, though it hinted at the fact that the change had occurred, once again, due to the changes the lotus had made to his body. So basically, this once again had something to do with laws. Most likely. Probably. Maybe. After considering those two abilities and thinking of ways he would test them out in the future, he turned his attention to his body. Before his breakthrough, he had already had a massive increase in strength, which had only been compounded now. The good news was, even without him having to consciously practice, his brain was quickly adjusting to new strength. He would still have to fine-tune his control, but the chances of him accidentally crushing someone's hand while shaking hands had dropped to an all-time low. His thought process had sped up once again, and his capacity for multitasking had absolutely exploded. He could easily do multiple tasks at the same time without suffering any loss in his concentration. He wondered if he had gained anything special as a result of sticking to the true path as it was called in the crystal realm, meaning cultivating spirit, soul, and body at the same time. His intuition told him yes, though he could not figure out what specifically he had gained. He tried using the techniques he had learned for the foundation realm. The amount of strength they could display was inherently limited, meaning Lex would have to learn new techniques if he wanted to fully display the limits of his power. Still, they had become much more powerful than they were previously, and it was much easier to use them as is. For example, the teleportation technique Lex never got an opportunity to use called the in-law effect, which originally required him to stay stationary for 3 hours while he primed the technique, now barely took a minute for him to complete. Once he became used to his new realm, the time might even become shorter. Evisceration, the sole attack that he barely ever used because of how difficult it was to master, seemed to be the only technique that did not suffer a limit on its strength. Not only was it able to display a much greater strength than before, unfortunately the difficulty in using it also increased. The plus side was, since Lex had grown in his level, even if using the technique caused a backlash, he was more than strong enough to take it without suffering any real harm. If there was one thing about his breakthrough that Lex didn't like, however, was that it more or less eliminated his hunger. He had more than enough energy in his body to keep himself running even if he didn't eat for weeks. Moreover, since his body had such high energy requirements, which were usually being met by the energy stored within his golden core, if he wanted to be satiated, the food he would have to eat would have to be much more nutritious than before. Lex tightened his fists, and a firm look appeared in his eyes. He would never give up on eating delicious food. It seemed like it was time to hire an excellent chef. Better yet, it was time to find someone with a cooking system and hire them. Occasionally missing content, please report errors in time. Chapter 468 Dread. I was hired for a special case, said the morose man, the tip of his index finger tracing the rim of his glass. Surrounding him, the usually noisy bar was completely silent as the guests listened to his story with keen interest. The fact that I was hired spoke enough of the seriousness of the case to begin with. After all, the best of the best used to come to me to ask for internships. There was no detective better than me, because I was beyond what could be measured. With a 100% case resolution rate, my prices were sky high. The fact that they were willing to pay my dues spoke enough of their desperation. The man, sporting a thin mustache above his lip, and wearing a brown-colored trench coat, looked down as he shook his head and sighed. His hat sat lonely atop the wooden bar, looking beaten and worn. How was I supposed to know that this case would be different? The man, who was completely human and in no way anything related to a crustacean, came from a planet called Terra, the geography and history of which were remarkably similar to Earth without any correlation at all. If one distinct difference had to be identified, it was that Terra suffered from a lot more paranormal activity than Earth. The year was 1966, the place was Chicago, the time was the dead of night and the place was the victim's apartment building, up on the 4th floor of a government housing building. I was alone, for I couldn't have others with me while I investigated, slowing me down. The apartment was a mess. All the furniture was broken, everything was on the floor, the brand new television set was turned on, though one of its legs was broken so it was slumping low. The endless noise of static from the television filled the room, drowning out all other sound. I walked in the stillness of the room, unafraid of the dark, as I reviewed all the evidence. I had never seen anything like it. The murder weapon could not be what the evidence suggested. It was impossible. Most others agreed that the victim had died from the fall, as the broken wall would suggest he had been flung from there while he was still alive. But no, I could tell he was dead long before his body hit the ground. Troubled, I continued my search. Canada, Mexico, Brazil, England, China, Japan, I traveled the world hunting down all the victims the serial killer had left behind. But the more I searched, the more troubled I became. It just did not make sense. At this point the man sighed, and gulped down his drink. His eyes looked out into the distance, as if he could view the memory like a film on a television screen. Then one night I found myself in India. There were rumors of the death of a prince, and the signs left behind by the murderer were all too familiar. Well, he wasn't really a prince, but his family lived in a castle, so he may as well have been. My car had broken down, so I was forced to walk the road. I would have reached my destination by morning had I continued, but destiny had other plans. In the hot, humid night a strange buzzing sound reached me. I paid it no mind, there were enough flies around me to account for the buzzing. Only, the sound slowly started to grow louder. Still, I was lost in my own thoughts, unaware of the impending danger. It was only when I felt the vibrations in the road beneath my feet that I awoke from my thoughts, but by then, it was too late. I could hear the sounds of the revving engine behind me. The flashing headlights illuminated the road, but all I could see was my life flashing before my eyes. I knew what had happened. The serial killer had come after me. The dreaded mass murderer, known only by his alias, Truck Kuan, had finally decided I was too close. I turned around to get a good look, but all I saw were two flashing yellow headlights. A truck horn straight from hell sounded out in the night right before Truck-kun smashed into me. But luck was in my corner that night. The horn startled me enough that I fell backwards, and coincidentally, fell through the golden doors of the Midnight Inn. I was saved a hair's breadth, and now I had seen the murderer with my own eyes. It would not escape me in the future. Or at least, that's what I thought. Silence once again filled the room as everyone listened with bated breaths. This was the key part. It was only when I arrived at the inn, and gained access to the heavenly Henali portal, did I realize how wrong I was. Truck-kun was not a mass murderer choosing its victims across the globe. No, instead, the signs of its influence spanned the realm. Galaxies far and wide, planets remote and hidden, none of it mattered. When Truck-kun found a victim it wanted to claim, none could escape it. So far, I am the only one who has looked into the gleaming lights of death and survived. The man's speech was cut short by the sound of screaming. Someone was yelling something at the top of their lungs, and coming closer. The next moment, the doors burst open and yet another guest of the inn bent over, panting as hard as possible. "There's been another murder," he managed to say, between long bated breaths. This time the victim was a nascent cultivator. The room full of teenagers and young adults, all fans of comics and novels with unlucky lives, all suddenly had goosebumps. They all fit the pattern for Truck-kun's victims perfectly. They had gathered at the Midnight Inn to discuss ways to elude this monster that exclusively hunted weebs, anime enthusiasts, and fantasy fans. But it did not seem like there was a solution. The dreaded Truck-kun could not be stopped. Occasionally missing content, please report errors in time. Chapter 469 Chopsticks. Lex spent the next 2 days getting used to the changes in his body. Getting used to his new strength was the easy part, as his brain did most of the work for him. To further refine his control, he used chopsticks to move rice from one bowl to another, one grain at a time. The chopsticks themselves were quite flimsy, and every time he accidentally broke them, he started from the beginning. This method seemed pretty stupid when considering all the resources available to him, but sometimes it was just about putting in the work. He quickly gained precise control over his strength, not only in both his hands, but his feet as well, though he hadn't used chopsticks to train them. His dual vision was difficult to get used to be honest. It might have been easier if both his eyes had obtained the upgrade, but since they hadn't, he had to keep track of both streams of data consciously. In all honesty, it was something he was completely capable of doing due to his recent improvements, but it was just tedious. It was like constantly being aware of your breathing. One could, of course, consciously take control and maintain the required rhythm, but it was so much easier when it was something being done on autopilot. In the end, it was not something he overcame. Instead, while browsing all the techniques he got from the Infinity Emporium, Lex found a technique that trains the spirit, allowing him to multitask better. It was like splitting his mind into two, to perform two different tasks without bothering or being affected by the other. This was something he could already do to some degree due to his new realm, but the difference between being able to do, and training to do it specifically, was huge. Moreover, the moment he started training in the technique, his intuition told him that the effects of this technique would compound. Since it was focused on training the spirit and not the brain, every time the spirit grew stronger, the effect would increase without him making any additional effort. Currently he could completely focus on 3 different things without suffering any interferences in his concentration or having a drop in his performance. One of those 3 things was constantly dedicated to his new eyesight, so now he could easily switch between focusing on one stream of information over the other, without really stopping his eyesight. He had no progress so far as discovering what characteristics his affinity had, although he had determined that it wasn't corrosive or hazardous in any way. What he had not been able to do, however, was train his spirit and soul sense properly. He had attained some initial progress, to the effect of being able to keep his senses from extending out of his body randomly, but not much else. Unfortunately, the regal embrace did not provide him with some kind of training regimen to train those, so Lex had to rely on other resources. Finally, after spending 2 days locked up in his room, he came out. But, this time he did not appear as the Innkeeper, nor did he appear as Leo. This time, he came out as Lex. One reason was that he needed to drop a few hints of his identity, though even that he would not do purposefully. He was going to browse the Henali portal for guides on learning how to train his spirit senses. The portal had both free and paid services, and apparently some kind of hidden authority system, as Lex learned. After all, it was a network available to the entire realm, so how could there not be tiers? Lex currently only had access to the common tier of the portal, with no idea of how to reach a higher authority. For now, though, it was completely irrelevant to him, since the kind of information he needed could be accessed publicly. Besides that, there was one more thing he wanted to do that he could only do as Lex. The system wielder who had been following Suzuki, the man Larry had fought, was now spending a lot of time with Larry over the past few days. Lex wanted to make contact personally and learn a little more about him. He could have spied on him using the system, but his way he wanted to test out if his eyesight could detect the system as well, and that was only something he could do in person. Moreover, the new group of people Larry had been hanging out with were extremely suspicious. Lex wanted to get to know them better as well. After all, more than once, he had seen Anakin lead people into the Chamber of Secrets to conduct secret business meetings. Even he could not spy on them in there, for it was strictly forbidden by the system. With his agenda set, Lex strolled through the inn as he took in the festive mood. Even if nothing special was happening, everyone was just happy about their breakthroughs. Lex wasn't able to help the smile that appeared on his face as he enjoyed the positive feedback the inn kept getting. Finally, things were going well for once without any problems randomly popping up. He did not spend too long strolling around, for training still had priority. After registering himself on the portal, he quickly logged on and began searching for guides related to spirit sense and soul sense training. For spirit sense, he immediately found many guides, both paid and unpaid. For soul sense, however, let alone guides, he couldn't even find a mention of it. He highly doubted that it was such a rare thing that it had never been encountered before. Most likely, this was one of the topics that was hidden behind the secret authorities or tiers mentioned earlier. Overcoming his disappointment, Lex glanced through one of the free tutorials available. Initially, he found it very informative, but as he continued, a strange look appeared in his eyes. Why was this using chopsticks, too? Chapter 470 Spiritual Treasure. While spirit sense was mostly illusory, it could also be used to interact with physical objects. It was not a replacement for physical strength, usually, but still the ability to pick up or somehow manipulate items far away was very useful. The process of interacting with physical items was broken down into a few simple steps so that beginners could focus on each individual step while they learned. First was, naturally, wrapping the intended item with his spirit sense. Then Lex would channel some spirit energy into his spirit sense, giving it the strength to harden temporarily at certain points, allowing it to touch physical items. Then, based on his control of his spirit sense, he could use the hardened portion of his sense to grab onto and manipulate the item as needed. There were countless techniques that allowed cultivators to use spirit sense to gain greater strength than their physical bodies, attack the mind, control weapons, and more. From the Golden Core onwards, cultivation became infinitely more complicated because there was so much more that a cultivator could do. But all of that began with training the spiritual sense itself. Much like hand-eye coordination needed to be trained, and to some extent was being trained from birth, so too did the spiritual sense need to be trained. The first step of training spiritual sense in many videos began the same way, which was to first get an easily available spiritual treasure, which was specifically designed to aid in learning how to control spiritual sense. It was just that, the tutorial with the most views, and the one that Lex was watching started with not one treasure but two. More specifically, it started with procuring a pair of chopsticks which were also spiritual treasures. Varying from normal treasures, which to cultivators usually either meant natural resources which could aid in some facet of cultivation, or man-made items which could facilitate the use of spiritual energy, often even enhancing it. Spiritual treasures were designed specifically to be used with spiritual sense. Lex watched the entire tutorial and thoroughly understood the requirements of each step in the training before exiting the portal. One issue with using the Henali portal at the inn, rather than on a planet that had been connected through the proper procedure, was the lack of a delivery service. No matter how affordable the treasure was, it could not be delivered to the inn. One reason was that the delivery service probably wouldn't have golden keys to enter the inn, but even in a situation where the Midnight Inn became so popular that everyone had golden keys, using the portal at the inn disabled location and tracking. It was literally impossible to enter his location as the Midnight Inn while using the portal. But all was not lost. One of the features of the ongoing festival were stalls that had been set up, allowing guests to sell items and trinkets from their locale. He would first check that market to see if a spiritual treasure matching his requirements was available. If it wasn't, then he would place a request at the guild room. At the same time, Lex pulled out his personal hologram which he, as a guest, would have had and said, "Can you please forward a message from me to the guest Larry, he's an old friend of mine. Tell him I'll be at the local markets." The hologram nodded and disappeared. The personal holograms could fulfill many of the guests' simple requests such as this, and weren't just limited to answering questions. It was not a commonly known feature, but with time it was slowly catching on. More importantly, and more relevant than the additional features of the hologram, by inviting Larry to come to him instead of approaching him while he was at his new group, Lex would avoid any suspicion that he was approaching them for a hidden reason. Not that anyone would have any reason to suspect him to begin with. Since there was nothing wrong with two friends meeting, Lex was becoming used to thinking about every situation in layers. By doing this, he eliminated even the possibility that someone would suspect him of his real agenda, which was to scope out the system wielder. After all, Lex only invited Larry. They would not have had any idea that he already knew that they would likely follow him. Lex hailed a golf cart and made his way to the village, where the local market had been set up, and began to peruse. He could, of course, find out if what he wanted was available if he scanned the system, but he was also using this opportunity to study his eyesight and try to ascertain the limits of what it could show him. A short while later, his hologram appeared once again, informing him that Larry was on his way to meet him. Lex smirked. Everything was going according to plan. Well, at least it was, until Larry and his group closed in, and Lex's intuition immediately started acting, warning him that there was immense danger. Lex was genuinely alarmed, for he couldn't understand who or what could threaten him while he was at the inn. But it was not a mortal danger that he faced. Lex was still not experienced enough with his intuition to understand what it was trying to tell him. Unfortunately, he was not able to identify the kind of danger, but he at least narrowed it down to who it was coming from. It was one unassuming member of Larry's group. Lex scanned him to discover his name was Noman, but the system gave him no other important information. His left eye, however, picked up on something. There were strange, invisible waves coming out of and entering his body, mixing in with the environment around him. "Lex, you sly fellow, where do you disappear to?" Larry yelled loudly over the noise of the crowd as he closed in, his usual stupid smile painting his face. He was still as excitable and jolly as ever. Lex was about to give a casual reply, stating that he wasn't busy with anything important, before passing a remark about Larry's own busy schedule. He was about to, but before the words left his mouth, his intuition acted up. This time, he understood the feeling well. No matter what, he must not lie. "I've been traveling a lot," Lex said with a smile as he greeted his old friend. Yet behind his bright smile and eager eyes, his mind was already compiling a list of everything he could and couldn't say, if he was unable to lie. After all, he was a man with many secrets. Chapter 471, Talented Group. "What about you? Been busy lately? How many girlfriends have you run through by now?" Lex asked casually, trying to divert the topic of conversation from himself. "I still have the same girlfriend. I'll introduce you to her," he said awkwardly. Lex could not help but notice how he loosened up his color as he said that, his eyes darting into the distance as his thoughts wandered. Oh? Was there some gossip here? Delma would surely be interested in this. Silently, he betrayed his friend as he told Mary to inform Delma about this. We can talk more about that later, Larry quickly said the moment he snapped free from his thoughts. Instead, I should ask, are you busy? I have a couple of things I want to talk to you about. Not that busy. I was looking for a spiritual treasure to train my spirit sense, but I haven't been able to find one so far. Ah yes, I remember going through that hassle. What you dash Larry suddenly paused, and then looked at Lex with a look of genuine shock. Wait, you've reached the Golden Core realm? Lex shrugged as if it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Yeah, I did. I don't know why you're surprised if you were able to reach it even quicker than I. No, but you. Larry shook his head and looked at Lex as if he was seeing the man for the first time. Although he always held Lex in high regard, for he knew he wasn't simple, this was taking things a bit beyond just that. He knew how valuable his own secret was to help him grow so quickly. The fact that Lex could keep up, even if he was a bit slower, meant that his secrets were also probably not too lacking when compared to his own. Larry's wide grin promptly returned as he wrapped his arm around Lex's neck. This is a reason to celebrate, he said, and celebrate we shall by finally getting you a girl. Lex elbowed the man and pushed him away. The man literally never thought about anything other than girls. Lex thought to tease him about it, since last he recalled he was actually not so skilled at flirting, but it seemed he had managed to maintain a relationship for a while. As a young bachelor, Lex really felt like elbowing him a little harder. His strange metallic body should be able to tolerate it, right? Haha, alright. Forget about the treasure, I'll get you a good one later. I have a guy who handles simple things like this. Instead, let me introduce you to some people. This is Raphael, Marlowe's son. Lex put on a surprised expression as he turned to look at the mature man. He was already in the chi training realm once again, and making steady progress. As a man in his mid-30s, he looked the oldest of the bunch and definitely stood out, but at the rate his cultivation was going it wouldn't be long before he regained his youthful demeanor. It's a pleasure, said Lex as he shook the man's hand. Likewise, replied Raphael as he tried to recall if he'd heard of Lex from his memories of the future. After all, such a young golden core cultivator, especially one from Earth, was someone who should have had a lot of fame. But he was drawing a blank. Little did he know, in the version of the future he knew, since Marlowe never trained Lex, his experience at Vigus Minima had been so bad, Lex had decided to slow down the growth of the inn to a dead stall. It took him many years to reach the golden core in that timeline due to his caution and lack of opportunities. This spry young lad here is Anakin, and this is Noman, he said, continuing with the introductions. And finally, this brooding fellow is Zuda. Or Suda. Or something like that. I've given up on trying to pronounce his name, I hope you have better luck. Lex nodded at each of the three guys separately, paying special attention to each of them. Noman was the source of the danger he was detecting, and he could see something odd happening around him from his left eye, but see nothing else. With Anakin, he couldn't see anything worthy of notice, but his soul sense brushed past him mostly because he still couldn't control it, and that's when Lex noticed two souls within the man's body. That only left Suda, the system wielder. All of them, alongside Raphael, who had a mysterious treasure inside his heart, formed a strange group of people with unbelievable secrets. Lex could not help but think that if this were a novel, each one of them would be worthy of being either an antagonist or protagonist in the series. Let's find somewhere more private to talk, said Larry. Lex, who was keen on trying to understand what objectives such a collection of talented young men could have, took the opportunity to test out the warning from his intuition about being truthful. I have a cabin on the midnight train. We can talk there, he said, wearing an expression of showing off as he looked at Larry. Before the other could respond, however, a whisper interrupted him, saying, he's lying. Although it was only a whisper, and they were on a crowded street, as cultivators so close to the source, they all heard him. Lex wore an awkward expression as an unknown light flashed through his eyes. What I mean is, by the time we reach the station, I can arrange to get a cabin. Don't worry, it's just a minor cost to me, and I've always wanted to try it, anyway. Lex looked at Noman as he spoke, but the other did not show any concern, as if the explanation was not for him. Lex, on the other hand, was thinking about the implications of what just happened. Fortunately, his intrigue did not need to be disguised. Once they reached the cabin, Lex could directly ask Larry. Chapter 472 Spiel. Lex looked outside the cabin window as the train finally began to move from the station, admiring the beautiful view. The first of purple crystals was a particularly enchanting sight, and stood out for miles around. "Hey, I can't believe you pulled this off," said Larry, not bothering to hide his amazement in his voice. The fact that an entire carriage had to be rented at a time, which was extremely expensive, was not even the start of it. The train was extremely popular and there was always a line, ready to book any carriages the moment they got free. The fact that Lex had been able to book it without even being present spoke of his connections and reach. "Your friends seemed to think I was lying," Lex said with a smirk, as if he had just proven the other wrong. "Don't mind Noman. He wasn't targeting you, he just takes everything very literally. Speaking of the devil, come on, let's sit with the others. There are a few things we have to discuss, and I think you'll find them interesting." Lex nodded and followed Larry into another, particularly lavishly furnished cabin and took a seat. There was no table at which they could all sit, but due to the size of the cabin, even sitting in individual sofas, they were all near enough to hold a normal conversation. "Gents, I'd like to introduce you to Lex Williams, a good friend of mine. He's a reliable fellow, and quite resourceful, as you've probably noticed. Lex, the reason we're all here, and the reason I've even called you here, is because of an issue that I've been facing." The jolly look on Larry's face finally disappeared, and even his tone turned cold. "I'm sure you remember that I'm being hunted down on Earth. To be honest, a part of me just wanted to give up and move permanently to the inn. I had no hope of finding my family, I've just come to accept that they're probably dead. Not to mention, I've heard if I increase my privilege level enough, I can teleport to another planet. I was thinking of getting out forever. But it seems that whoever is after me is not content to leave things alone. They sent assassins after me, to the inn as well. Thanks to Noman, I was able to identify the assassins and take care of things. Well, I took care of one. Suda here used to work with the one I took care of." Lex looked at the man with an eyebrow raised. "What happened, you switched sides? And if you don't mind me asking, how did you identify the assassins?" Lex asked Suda and Noman the questions directly. This was the freedom using his own identity allowed him that being the innkeeper restricted him from. As an all-knowing and wise innkeeper, it was inappropriate to ask so many questions so easily. "My previous master was a corrupt man. I was forced to listen to him for certain reasons, but once he died, I was freed from my restraints." Lex's left eye could not pick up any signs of a system on Suda at all, and though Lex tried to use his soul sense on him, it was difficult to control it for now. "I didn't do much," Noman answered simply. "I was just passing by when they approached Larry for the first time and happened to notice they were lying to him. Still, I didn't do much. I might have pointed out their lie, I don't remember really." "The issue is not with the assassins," Larry continued. "The issue is that we still don't know who is after me. Raphael even used his father's contacts to see if it was someone from the Council of New Order. But we were not able to find anything. Even the councilman who did act against me seemed to be doing it on someone else's behalf." Something suddenly clicked in Lex's mind, and he summoned a file that Velma had once given him about the prisoners who were secretly controlling Earth. He wasn't worried that anyone would wonder where he got the file from, for he had a bangle with a hidden space inside of it now. It could explain everything. "I might have an idea of who might be behind it," Lex cut Larry off, as he handed him the file, and explained how every major conflict on Earth, including the one orchestrated by the Council of New Order, was actually being masterminded by others. While Lex was explaining, everyone kept looking at Noman from time to time, as if waiting for him to spot a lie, but it never came. Larry hid his emotions well, but the focus with which he was reading the file spoke much about his mental state. Most curiously, Lex noticed that Larry was the only one to have the expected reaction. Everyone else. Lex, I feel like I'm meeting a long-lost brother, said Anakin as he eyed the man greedily. Larry said you're resourceful, but I didn't expect you to be on a level entirely of your own. Let me introduce myself properly a little, while Larry reads the file. The name is Anakin, as you already know. But what you don't know is that I'm a businessman. In fact, I'm not just a businessman, I'm a man with an extraordinary vision, and ideas that could make us wealthy beyond our wildest dreams. The only reason I haven't succeeded already is because I need someone resourceful, who can help me out a little. I have a few, minor, completely irrelevant inconveniences stopping me. But I have a feeling that with your help, my operation can really take off. What do you say? Are you interested in working with me? If you don't trust my word, you can ask Larry to vouch for me. I'm an honest man, just trying to make an honest living. Before Anakin could continue his spiel, an earth-shattering clap of thunder roared across the inn, and a flash of lightning struck. Chapter 473, Tribulation. Everyone in the room was greatly startled by the noise, Lex included, let alone the red-eyed Larry who had been reading the file Lex gave him. Abruptly, everyone got up and ran to the window to see if they could identify what had caused the commotion. Even if they identified the sound as thunder, they couldn't be sure since too many unusual things happened at the inn. Lex was a step slower and allowed everyone to crowd the window in front of him, for in his mind he was already scanning the inn and investigating the cause. Something genuinely strange was happening, as the weather at the inn had escaped Lex's control for the first time. A dark cloud had formed over a remote area of the inn, and seemed to be going larger at a steady pace. Lex did not fail to notice that right underneath it was one of the more lavish abodes he had created. Among the types of accommodation the inn offered usually were the normal room, small house, large house, courtyard, and finally, the small village. Although he imagined that anyone in retreat might want to do it alone, he did not leave the decision up to himself, and designed abodes to accommodate more people as well. The largest abodes he made were the size of a small village. The abode that had been subjected to the lightning strike was one such abode, and it was occupied by a devil who was currently breaking through from the nascent realm. The devil was not surprised by the lightning strike, and it had not prevented his breakthrough at all. Lex did even get an opportunity to wonder why this was happening when the familiar sound of a system notification rang in his ears. New quest: a guest is undergoing a realm breakthrough and is experiencing his first tribulation. As a universal establishment, the inn is a perfect location to undergo a tribulation for those searching for a safe environment. Add facilities to the inn centered around undergoing tribulations. Add a lightning tempering room, new room unlocked. 2. Add a flame tempering room, new room unlocked. 3. Create a tribulation room, new feature unlocked. Quest reward, subject to performance. Lex was reading the notification, but as a result of new multitasking ability, he could easily focus on multiple things at the same time. This meant he could continue to hold a conversation with a person, giving them full and sufficient attention, without being distracted from his other task. Given that, he did not lose out on the opportunity to tease Anakin. Go ahead, tell me you're an honest man one more time, and let's see if lightning strikes again. Lex's casual remark cut through the tension in the room, and while Anakin was left with his mouth hung open, unsure of how to reply, the others looked at him with interest. His cavalier attitude indicated he knew what was going on. I don't know if he's honest, but he never lies, said Noman as he returned to his seat. It was Lex's calm attitude that made something click in his mind, allowing him to realize what was happening. Truthfully speaking, with his background, it was embarrassing that he wasn't the first to realize what was happening. What was that? Asked Anakin, wanting to divert the topic of conversation from himself. It's a lightning tribulation, Noman answered casually. It's rare to see one, actually. But I guess the aid to everyone cultivation brought by the star rank increase pushed whoever is going through it over the edge. Chances are, we'll see a lot more of them. What's a lightning tribulation? Anakin asked, returning to his seat. There was another flash of light during this time, but no sound this time. That was because Lex had added a sound insulation feature to every single abode at the inn. If more tribulations would come, the noise would make it impossible for anyone to go about peacefully. I don't know in too much detail, since it's not relevant to me yet. But basically, in all the realms after nascent, trying to break through to a higher realm causes a tribulation. Lightning and fire tribulations are the ones I know about, but I know that there's supposed to be more on higher levels. What those are? I have no idea, though I heard a rumor that some extinct races have become a part of the tribulations. What that means? I have no idea. If it's nothing to be alarmed about, can we focus on this? Larry said, holding out the file. He had recomposed himself by now, though anyone could tell he was holding himself back. Not waiting for anyone to ask, he briefly described everything he had read about how all wars and conflicts on Earth were games to a few people who were being held as prisoners on Earth. Other than Nomen, who had never been to Earth, everyone was extremely shocked by what they heard. Even the cool and composed Raphael was having drastic mood swings, though he managed to keep his cool. Anakin wasn't too aggrieved personally, but even he realized that this was not a small matter. How did you even find out all of this? Raphael asked, looking at Lex. Lex, though, was not pressured by the attention and only smirked. I have reliable sources, though if you don't believe me, that's your right. Honestly, I wouldn't have shared this with you all to begin with if I didn't think this matter had something to do with whoever is hunting Larry. It has to be one of the prisoners, if not the same ones, causing all the problems. The question is, what can we do about this? Everyone turned to look at Nomen, who only nodded and said nothing else. It seemed Lex was telling the truth. There are a lot of things you may or may not know, so I'll speed you through it. Earth, and the rest of the solar system are considered property of some people or organization. I'm not sure who. They've been using the fact that Earth lacks spiritual energy to use it as a prison. I tried to pass this information to them through the Council of New Order, but it seems to me like they haven't done anything to address the situation. As much as I want to just go to Earth and kill the people responsible, I don't know if we'll be able to handle the repercussions if the people who own Earth take offense. One possible solution I thought of was if we invited the Jotun Empire over to Earth. They seem to have an interest in expanding, and if they could do for Earth what they did for the Vegas planets, we'd be much better off. It's a good plan, said Raphael, with a disappointed voice. But it won't work. As for how I know, I have sources of my own as well. Chapter 474 Room Design. What do you mean? Lex asked with a frown. He didn't want to take any drastic actions on Earth, nor did he want to be responsible for any of them doing anything drastic either. The reason he had shared this information was because he was sure he had a handle on things. Although killing a few prisoners on Earth was not hard, he did not want to find out how the organization that had been using Earth as a prison would react to such hostility. After all, even if he could retreat to the inn, not everyone could. An organization that had been capable of interstellar travel, and who had been using Earth as a prison should not be weak at all. Let alone, he did not forget that even Batet and Phallic, two demi-dailords, were prisoners on Earth as well. Things being handled peacefully or through negotiations was the best idea. I mean, the Jotun Empire will not interfere with anything on Earth. As for how or why I know this, I can't say. Memories from his past life flashed in his mind. Things had changed a lot when spiritual energy returned to Earth, and most of them were not in a good way. Once again everyone looked at Nomen, who only shrugged. Lex took this opportunity to wear an irritated expression and ask, "Why do you all keep looking at him?" An awkward silence filled the room as everyone looked at Nomen. Everyone here had shared secrets with one another, though Nomen's was the only one everyone remembered. Still, that experience had built a bond of trust amongst them, and it did not feel right to just include Lex inside it without him sharing his secret as well. "I did not expect this conversation to reach this point so quickly," said Anakin, who was once again wearing a sly smile. "The inn has this little room called the Chamber of Secrets. Are you familiar with it, Lex?" The question was a rhetorical one, for he did not expect Lex to actually know, and was once again about to enter his usual persuasive speech when Lex nodded firmly. "Oh, yes, perfect then, that saves me from having to explain it to you," he said, the disappointment in his voice evident. "Well, the point being, we all here have some personal matters we'd like to keep personal. There are certain things we'd like to keep that way, but if we can come to an agreement, we won't mind continuing this conversation inside the chamber. That way, everyone's secrets stay safe and we can move the conversation forward." Lex did not reply immediately, and continued to look at Anakin with a scrutinizing gaze. There was definitely more than met the eye about this group, and curiosity about their secrets had already occupied a corner of Lex's mind. This was also an excellent way to learn more about Sutta, as well as Nomen. The issue about Earth, well, if that was a matter that could be resolved as well, then he had nothing to lose by joining them. Besides, he knew exactly what secret to share. "All right," Lex said finally, and leaned back on his sofa. A silence filled the room as everyone waited. As it happened, one of the train stations happened to be near the point where the Chamber of Secrets was located, so all they had to do now was wait till then. Lex, however, was more occupied than he seemed as he was focused on his latest quest. Lightning Tempering Room. A room in which cultivators can temper their body, spirit or soul, with varying levels of lightning. Disclaimer: even the lowest level of lightning is meant for nascent level cultivators, and can cause injuries or even death if not adequately prepared. Disclaimer: due to limited system functionality, any upgrade to the lightning tempering room will require the Innkeeper to manually provide new types of lightning before upgrade becomes available. Fire Tempering Room. A room in which cultivators can temper their body, spirit or soul, with varying levels of fire. Disclaimer: even the lowest level fire is meant for nascent level cultivators, and can cause injuries or even death if not adequately prepared. Disclaimer: due to limited system functionality, any upgrade to the fire tempering room will require the Innkeeper to manually provide new types of fire before upgrade becomes available. Both the new tempering rooms were meant specifically for nascent realm cultivators, and cost a hefty 15,000 MP per hour to use. Lex decided to set the price at 20,000 MP per hour to use them, and would require the guest to have a prestige level of at least 2. The matter relating to upgrading them was something that would require his personal effort, but it was a matter for the future, since he would need to develop a deeper understanding of their limits before working on that. Instead, the remainder of his focus was on the third room. Tribulation Room. A room guests can rent while undergoing tribulations. That one simple sentence was the entire description for this room, mainly because there was a new feature he had unlocked as well which he was supposed to use on the tribulation room. Room Design. Using the various existing abilities and features of the inn, alongside available upgrades, the Innkeeper can design a new kind of room to fulfill certain requirements for guests that the inn needs but is lacking. The newly designed room will become a part of the system and will operate based on the conditions set by the Innkeeper. The expanse and functionality of the room will be determined based on the used features. All upgrades to designed rooms will require the Innkeeper to manually bring in required resources and outline additional features. This was one of the most amazing features Lex had received so far. To an extent, he was already doing this with various rooms and buildings that he created then retrofitted with formations. But when compared to rooms provided directly by the system, they had always been lacking. Now though, he could really take things a step further. Chapter 475: Watching Children Play. Although it did not seem like it, as Lex walked quietly with the group towards the Chamber of Secrets, he was actually doing multiple things at the same time. A part of him was paying attention to the ongoing lightning tribulation. The devil, to be entirely honest, he had started the tribulation with a convincing performance, but the longer it went on, the worse his condition became. Parts of his body were already charred and smoking, and he had given up his humanoid form to revert to his true devil form. Lex expected that the form would be quite gruesome, but it was far from the truth. While the large body with wings and horns and red skin looked mighty intimidating, it also looked regal and authoritative, not at all the vile, disgusting appearance Lex had been expecting. But whatever the case, if there was to be a fire tribulation following the lightning one, he did not know how the devil planned on surviving with its existing wounds. Another part of him was entirely focused on the new room design feature. It was incredible and versatile, but also tricky. Lex tried to create a training room with the additional qualities of the simple recovery room, which sped up the body's natural healing. He was only experimenting and wanted to see how it would turn out. Moreover, it wasn't a bad idea in case someone was training a technique that would constantly push them to the limit. Lex achieved what he wanted. But because he did not calibrate it properly, or take into consideration how the various features of the inhabitants lacked synergy with one another, the room he created cost an incredible 34,000 MP per hour. At that point, the price of the room was far beyond the reach of the target audience, and it became impractical and pointless. But that was fine. After all, he was experimenting for the sake of learning how to use it, anyway. He would slowly work out how best to join the unique features of the inn together. The remainder of his focus had been on the simple task of devising a loophole to prevent the Chamber of Secrets from erasing his memory somehow. His leading strategy was to have Mary hear everything and inform him later on. Yet Mary herself did not think it would work. Like I told you, since the description of the chamber specifically said that not even the innkeeper would be able to spy on the secrets stored in there, it won't be so simple to work around it. There's a very high chance the system will block off my connection to you the moment you enter. That's ridiculous. Why would the system block you out? It's never done that before. It's a matter of integrity. Since the system itself focused on maintaining secrecy, then keeping the secret is a part of the inn's prestige. Let's just see. In the end, there was not much he could do if the system had accounted for loopholes. When the group arrived, they found the chamber deserted, as usual, and did not hesitate to enter. While Lex did not feel much of a change, besides the point that his connection to Mary, and his connection to the system, were put under restrictions, the rest of the group trembled once they entered. According to the agreement they had set, they would not recall any of the secrets they shared with one another, unless all relevant members were within the chamber at the same time. Larry and Sutta had not revealed their secrets completely, but they had shared enough to gain the attention of the group. Even then, how could they have compared with the likes of Noman and Raphael? Noman, whose ability knew no limitations, could prove to be extremely valuable. Trusting the words of others was one of the most difficult things to do, but what if they had a perpetual truth detector besides them? How would anyone trick them? Then came Raphael. Although his experiences were limited to Earth, he had lived through the future and knew many of the incoming trials the planet would face. Anakin was suddenly reminded of the most important reason he had been trying to make so much money lately. He wanted to earn enough to use the prestige ability to escape Earth. He had only a few years before the first disaster struck. Lex noticed the odd behavior and hesitation the group showed and turned to look at them. Most of the group was looking at Raphael while the man in question was completely nonchalant and took a seat. Before we begin, Raphael said, looking at Lex. We need to establish an agreement first. Everyone here has shared something valuable with the group. It was not out of charity, and no one was coerced into it. Everyone had something to gain, and so we shared our secrets with one another for mutual benefit. At the same time, the moment we leave the chamber, it withdraws information about each other's secrets from our minds, protecting everyone. He paused again as everyone sat. He could not say for others, but he at least had an agenda for cooperating with a group of such uniquely talented people. Too much had changed on Earth from his memories, but those changes were mostly a result of changes on the planet itself. The external threats it faced were still coming, and not only did he need to strengthen himself for that, he needed powerful allies. But being greedy for skilled people could also endanger the group that had already been composed. As such, it was his duty to ensure that the group was not needlessly endangered. You do not have to share your secrets if they are not related, but for us to trust you, you have to reveal relevant details, at least. Moreover, I'd like to know what exactly you want. Larry has spoken highly of you, and you have shown your worth, so if you're here to help out Larry, that's one thing. But if that's the case, the way I see it, you don't really need to know our secrets. Just the fact that Larry trusts us should be enough. Countless thoughts ran through the group's mind as they heard Raphael's question. Every one of them, except Noman, had plans of their own, so they didn't mind the fact that Raphael instinctively used them to build the group's authority. If Lex ended up joining them, it would start them out at an advantage. Lex, however, felt like laughing. Instead of feeling interrogated, it felt like he was watching children playing a game. What did he want? Everything they could offer, of course. He resisted the urge to crack his knuckles and smile. It was time to learn all their secrets. He was a busy man, he had others to scheme against as well. Outside the chamber, the devil that had been undergoing the tribulation died, unable to survive it. The ash's body turned into has not even fallen to the floor before another 2 tribulations began at the inn. The constant flashing of lightning made the inn seem like a disco. Chapter 476, The Brains of the Operation. What do I want? Lex asked in an amused tone. He had to be careful with his wording, for he couldn't say they had nothing he wanted, for that would be a lie. He thought that he could avoid it by asking them a question instead, for example, do you even have something I could want? Yet while technically it was a question, it insinuated that they had nothing he wanted. Since the meaning being communicated was false, no one would be able to detect it, so Lex's intuition quickly shut him down. This was not something he could get through with half-truths and hidden meanings. I want many things, but will you give them to me just because I want them? My priority right now is to help Larry, but at the same time, resolve this issue with Earth. Whoever has been using it as a prison couldn't care less about how the prisoners are literally using the people of the planet like characters in a video game. Originally, I was planning on getting the Empire to help deal with them in exchange for taking control of the planet, but according to you, that won't work. So, for now, what I want is to focus on is why the Empire is not a good solution for Earth. As for anything else I might want from you, well, why don't you tell me first what you can offer to begin with? He smiled and looked at Raphael as he waited for the man to contemplate what he said. He could tell that, despite the fact that he had spent most of his life in a coma, he was a lot more mature than the rest. Which meant that convincing him would be the most difficult part. Of course, that was only relatively speaking. To Lex, it was all too simple to throw him off his game. He carefully observed Raphael, and just as he saw a change in the man's eyes, indicating that he was about to speak, Lex looked away and turned to Noman. Every time I say something, the group looks to you for confirmation. If I had to guess, you can tell whether a person is lying. Or at least something along those lines. Am I right? Before he had a chance to respond, Lex looked at Suda. You confuse me the most. You were previously working with the assassin who was targeting Larry, but now you're hanging out with Larry. I guess Noman already confirmed that you're not still after Larry, or that you never had any negative intentions towards him, so everyone is okay with you sticking around. But why do you want to stick around in the first place, anyway? Don't you have anything you would rather do? I recall you saying you were forced to obey your master previously. Don't tell me you're doing something cliché like following Larry now, because he defeated your master? Lex shook his head as if he said something completely impractical, but anything was possible when it came to systems. He then turned to Anakin. I don't even need to guess with you. You're a businessman, right? You're just in it to make money. I guess you find this group very profitable. Lastly, he looked back at Raphael, and this time, he spoke slowly and carefully. To be honest, I already know a lot about you. You spent the last dozen or so years asleep, right? It's a miracle that you're alive, let alone kicking and cultivating. I'm really genuinely curious about your sources for the Empire. They must be very impressive. Lex smiled as he waited for them to respond to his accusations. He had made sure to keep a friendly tone, he didn't want to sound too antagonizing, so as to draw hostility. Yet at the same time, by having their capabilities belittled and being goaded by him, they would feel the urge to let him know he was wrong by showing off. He was counting on the pride and inexperience of youth to force them into action. After all, even though Raphael was in his late 30s, the amount of time he had been awake was around the same as the rest. Yet while the rest immediately reacted to what he said, especially Anakin, Raphael stayed perfectly calm. In fact, the way he looked at Lex subtly changed, as if he was analyzing him. "I'll have you know I'm the brains of this operation," Anakin declared with a snort. "If it weren't for me bringing everyone to the chamber, and persuading them, all of them would still be glaring at one another like teenagers in a feud. And if you really want to know what's so special about me, just sign the agreement and I'll tell you." A screen suddenly appeared in front of Lex, asking him if he agreed to the terms of the agreement. Basically, all it said was that once he left the chamber, he would forget all sensitive information about the rest. In the future, even if he returned to the chamber, he would not be able to recall it unless the relevant person was in the chamber with him. This was the agreement everyone had signed. Even with Nomen, though they all remembered he could determine if a person was lying, they forgot the exact details of how it happened. Lex raised an eyebrow, and then accepted. This was going to happen, anyway. He also didn't doubt that the rest would share their secrets with him, eventually. The real reason he had goaded them was to get the spotlight off of him. It seemed to have worked, though Raphael was still observing him oddly intently. "Huh. I'll have you know, I have a grandpa who appears in my dreams and teaches me to wield the power of the dark side." Anakin vanished from right in front of him. Lex was startled, because even the sight from his left eye did not reveal where he was. A golf cart, larger than normal ones, pulled up in front of the Midnight Manor, and 5 men disembarked. They remained silent and quickly fell into formation, with 1 leading and 4 following closely behind. Though they did not put their auras on display, whether it was humans, devils, beasts, or other creatures, all could not help and turn to look at them. The man in the lead was too stunningly handsome, and the 4 behind him each moved with a charm solely of their own. Together, they bore the makings of a hugely successful boy band. Suddenly, one of the guests at the manor, a soldier from Ragnar's regiment, recognized the man in the lead and went completely pale and stiff. It was only complete instinct that made the soldier give his most rigid salute as he hoarsely yelled, "Emperor Jotun, Your Majesty!" Chapter 476, The Brains of the Operation. "What do I want?" Lex asked in an amused tone. He had to be careful with his wording, for he couldn't say they had nothing he wanted, for that would be a lie. He thought that he could avoid it by asking them a question instead, for example, "Do you even have something I could want?" Yet while technically it was a question, it insinuated that they had nothing he wanted. Since the meaning being communicated was false, no one would be able to detect it, so Lex's intuition quickly shut him down. This was not something he could get through with half-truths and hidden meanings. "I want many things, but will you give them to me just because I want them? My priority right now is to help Larry, but at the same time, resolve this issue with Earth. Whoever has been using it as a prison couldn't care less about how the prisoners are literally using the people of the planet like characters in a video game. Originally, I was planning on getting the Empire to help deal with them in exchange for taking control of the planet, but according to you, that won't work. So, for now, what I want is to focus on is why the Empire is not a good solution for Earth. As for anything else I might want from you, well, why don't you tell me first what you can offer to begin with?" He smiled and looked at Raphael as he waited for the man to contemplate what he said. He could tell that, despite the fact that he had spent most of his life in a coma, he was a lot more mature than the rest. Which meant that convincing him would be the most difficult part. Of course, that was only relatively speaking. To Lex, it was all too simple to throw him off his game. He carefully observed Raphael, and just as he saw a change in the man's eyes, indicating that he was about to speak, Lex looked away and turned to Noman. Every time I say something, the group looks to you for confirmation. If I had to guess, you can tell whether a person is lying. Or at least something along those lines. Am I right? Before he had a chance to respond, Lex looked at Suda. You confuse me the most. You were previously working with the assassin who was targeting Larry, but now you're hanging out with Larry. I guess Noman already confirmed that you're not still after Larry, or that you never had any negative intentions towards him, so everyone is okay with you sticking around. But why do you want to stick around in the first place, anyway? Don't you have anything you would rather do? I recall you saying you were forced to obey your master previously. Don't tell me you're doing something cliché like following Larry now, because he defeated your master? Lex shook his head as if he said something completely impractical, but anything was possible when it came to systems. He then turned to Anakin. I don't even need to guess with you. You're a businessman, right? You're just in it to make money. I guess you find this group very profitable. Lastly, he looked back at Raphael, and this time, he spoke slowly and carefully. To be honest, I already know a lot about you. You spent the last dozen or so years asleep, right? It's a miracle that you're alive, let alone kicking and cultivating. I'm really genuinely curious about your sources for the Empire. They must be very impressive. Lex smiled as he waited for them to respond to his accusations. He had made sure to keep a friendly tone, he didn't want to sound too antagonizing, so as to draw hostility. Yet at the same time, by having their capabilities belittled and being goaded by him, they would feel the urge to let him know he was wrong by showing off. He was counting on the pride and inexperience of youth to force them into action. After all, even though Raphael was in his late 30s, the amount of time he had been awake was around the same as the rest. Yet while the rest immediately reacted to what he said, especially Anakin, Raphael stayed perfectly calm. In fact, the way he looked at Lex subtly changed, as if he was analyzing him. I'll have you know I'm the brains of this operation, Anakin declared with a snort. If it weren't for me bringing everyone to the chamber, and persuading them, all of them would still be glaring at one another like teenagers in a feud. And if you really want to know what's so special about me, just sign the agreement and I'll tell you. A screen suddenly appeared in front of Lex, asking him if he agreed to the terms of the agreement. Basically, all it said was that once he left the chamber, he would forget all sensitive information about the rest. In the future, even if he returned to the chamber, he would not be able to recall it unless the relevant person was in the chamber with him. This was the agreement everyone had signed. Even with Noman, though they all remembered he could determine if a person was lying, they forgot the exact details of how it happened. Lex raised an eyebrow, and then accepted. This was going to happen, anyway. He also didn't doubt that the rest would share their secrets with him, eventually. The real reason he had goaded them was to get the spotlight off of him. It seemed to have worked, though Raphael was still observing him oddly intently. Huh. I'll have you know, I have a grandpa who appears in my dreams and teaches me to wield the power of the dark side. Anakin vanished from right in front of him. Lex was startled, because even the sight from his left eye did not reveal where he was. A golf cart, larger than normal ones, pulled up in front of the Midnight Manor, and 5 men disembarked. They remained silent and quickly fell into formation, with 1 leading and 4 following closely behind. Though they did not put their auras on display, whether it was humans, devils, beasts, or other creatures, all could not help and turn to look at them. The man in the lead was too stunningly handsome, and the 4 behind him each moved with a charm solely of their own. Together, they bore the makings of a hugely successful boy band. Suddenly, one of the guests at the manor, a soldier from Ragnar's regiment, recognized the man in the lead and went completely pale and stiff. It was only complete instinct that made the soldier give his most rigid salute as he hoarsely yelled, "Emperor Jotun, Your Majesty!" Chapter 477 Curse. The man who was addressed as Emperor only slightly nodded to the soldier and kept on walking. The 4 men behind him didn't slow their pace either, though one of them, a tall, young-looking man with dark hair and brown eyes, looked at the soldier for a brief moment. Why did that soldier recognize me, William? The Emperor asked, casually using his spiritual sense. Lieutenant Dan is a child from the Aragoni noble family. 3,000 years ago, you met one of their ancestors at a formal event and took a photo with them. It is likely framed in their family home. Another likely reason is that he is from the regiment led by General Ragnar, someone from Serafal's faction. Not only is Ragnar extremely loyal to the royal family, his growth record is phenomenal and he has shown excellent potential. Although he does not know it, his name has been entered into the potential candidates to marry into the royal family. Jotun merely nodded and kept on walking. Under the instructions of the Henali, he had arrived at the Midnight Inn to have a meeting with the innkeeper. Yet he was informed the innkeeper was currently occupied and they would have to wait. Jotun didn't mind. This seemed like an interesting place, with multiple tribulations happening at the same time. He could take this time to relax. He walked into the bar inside the Midnight Manor to find it mostly occupied by some group. The Emperor ordered a drink and sat in the corner to allow himself to relax. Yet before he could do so, he heard an interesting conversation. Trarkuan? A serial killer who can travel across multiple galaxies? Interest flickered in his eyes as he continued to listen. Lex continued to look at where Anakin had been when he disappeared, but found nothing. While he hadn't tested out finding him with his spirit sense, just the fact that Anakin could hide from his eyes either meant that he overestimated his eyes' capabilities, or that Anakin's abilities were more formidable than they appeared. Especially when one considered that he was just in the Chi training realm. Not bad, Lex commented, and looked to his left. Though Lex could not see him, his intuition was still working. If Anakin wanted to prank him, it would take a lot more than just that. Anakin was so startled when Lex looked at his invisible self directly in the eyes that his powers failed. The prankster quickly regained composure when he realized that he had become visible again, and returned to his seat as calmly as if nothing had happened. "You're right," Noman spoke as well as he sheepishly scratched the back of his head. "I can tell when someone is lying. I can even tell if what I'm reading is a lie. Even if someone tells the truth, but in a deceptive way, so that the understanding I get is false, I can tell it's a lie. Moreover, my ability has nothing to do with cultivation level. I've never met someone, regardless of how weak or strong they were, who was able to lie to me successfully." "That's not true," Lex mimicked him in his mind in amusement. Still, he was observing him closely. That ability was very impressive, and if it was not limited by cultivation realms. Well, Lex was tempted to hire him as an employee of the inn right away. "Not that I'm doubting you or anything, but do you mind if I test it out?" Lex asked as he focused more closely at the waves being emitted from Noman. "Sure, go ahead." "My name is Lex," he said, and observed if there was any reaction. Nothing unusual happened, and Noman didn't do anything either. "I am 27 years old," Lex said once again. He did not want to use obvious lies, and planned on mixing a few truths into his statements. Once or twice, he might mention an absurd lie just to see if Noman himself identifying the lie made any difference on his ability, and what effect it had on those waves. As he suspected, from the moment he started speaking there was a disruption in the waves. From being colorless, they gained a red color which, then, was absorbed into Noman's body. The moment the color was completely absorbed, Noman whispered, "He's lying." Lex accepted the answer and was about to continue when something even stranger happened. Noman looked up at Lex and said aloud, "You're lying." Lex frowned, and said a few more lines. The pattern with Gnome repeating himself twice continued. Even the rest of the group began to notice that something unusual was going on, and the confused looks on their faces told Lex that this wasn't something they were aware of. "Do you mind if I try something?" Lex asked. "Go ahead," Noman answered confidently. No one had been able to disrupt his ability before, and he was confident it would continue that way. Lex walked up to him and said, "I'm actually bald." The red-colored waves appeared once again, but this time Lex quickly moved his hand right above Noman's head, blocking the waves. Something absurd happened. The waves passed through Lex's hand, though he felt a strange resistance, but the red color remained behind. This time, Noman did not unconsciously whisper out that Lex was lying, but he did confidently look at Lex and declared his lie, completely ignoring the fact that identifying such an obvious lie should not have made him proud. But he did not get the reaction he was hoping for, as not only Lex, but the entire group was looking at him in a strange way. Lex tried a few more, less obvious lies, and the same thing happened. Lex did not know what the red color was, or why he was able to interact with it, but he did make a deduction of what was happening to Noman. He looked at Anakin and asked, "Does he always whisper when someone lies near him?" "Yes," Anakin answered, at exactly the same time as Noman, who said, "No." Lex frowned for a moment while he considered the possibilities, before he made his way back to his seat. "Noman, before you came to the inn, was there any chance someone was targeting you? It may have been a subtle feeling you had, or maybe you saw some hints indicating it." "There was nothing subtle about it. There was a group of people trying to kidnap me. If I had not been delivered a golden key just in time, I would have been caught." "Why do you ask?" It's just as I thought," Lex said slowly. "Someone has put a curse on you. Every time your ability is used, you can't help but say it out loud. There might be other aspects to it as well. My guess is, they're using that to track you. If you had tried to hide anywhere other than the inn, they would have found you." Suddenly, everyone in the group had an abrupt realization. Noman wasn't an idiot or completely oblivious to his own actions, as they had assumed. Someone had cursed him. Chapter 478, So Many Secrets. "A curse?" Noman repeated, startled. The scariest thing was that he could tell Lex wasn't lying. Moreover, everyone's reaction told him that they believe him too. "Well, to be specific, I don't know if it's a curse or a technique or something, but yes, someone has definitely done something to you. As for the tracking bit, that's purely my guess as well, but it makes sense. If I was kidnapping you, and came close enough to mark you, I would definitely leave some kind of tracker on you as well." Noman frowned but relaxed just as quickly. He leaned back into his chair comfortably and said, "Well, I wasn't planning on leaving the inn anytime soon, anyway. If they have the guts to try to kidnap me here, I say they should go for it." Lex was taken aback by Noman's cavalier attitude, but it seemed like whatever he said made sense. Since the curse was not harming him, and he was not planning on returning, there was no point in being worried. Besides, there was a very decent possibility that one day he'd be able to remove the curse on himself right from the inn. Lex shrugged and leaned back into his own chair. Regardless of the curse, Noman was worthy of keeping an eye on. The truth-only thing was tricky, but with his intuition always reminding him to be careful of what he said around Noman, there wasn't a chance he'd forget. The group was also taken aback by Noman's attitude, but it wasn't their place to comment. With Anakin and Noman starting to share already, there wasn't much point in holding back. But unfortunately, not everyone was as open as the other two. "Knowing my secret is not really relevant to anything we're doing," Sutta said calmly, "but for the sake of building trust, I'll share with you what I shared with the rest. For certain reasons, I had to obey Suzuki's every instruction, regardless of whether I wanted to or not. He took advantage of that to make me do many immoral acts for his own profit. I was more than happy to see him disposed of, and I did not hesitate to let them know that unless they fought him someplace he couldn't call me, he would force me to participate. If that were the case, their chances of success, let's just say they were really bad." "What about why you're still hanging around?" Lex asked, not worried that his excessive attention towards Sutta would cause curiosity or suspicion. After all, the man was a former assassin. It would in fact be strange if Lex weren't wary at all. Not to sound too critical, but Raphael was not wrong to question my motives. "I still don't understand yours, though. You have been freed of your master's control, so why are you still around?" This time even the cool and collected Raphael turned to look at Sutta. With Noman present, it was all but guaranteed that they could not lie, so while asking such a question was normally pointless, in the current situation it was a good way of ensuring no one was plotting against them. Sutta did not seem perturbed by the questioning though, and responded calmly. I had intentions to make amends to those that I have wronged. Anakin suggested that he knew a way that would allow me to make up for my sins. Since I lacked any ideas of my own, I decided to stick around. Anakin nodded firmly, as if proud of his role in making Sutta stay. Lex was unsatisfied with the answer, but he didn't press on. It seemed like he would have to take a more direct approach if he wished to get real answers. For now, that would have to wait. Before I share mine, said Raphael, once silence fell between the group and it was obvious that Lex had no more questions. Why don't you share the source of your information first? That way, when I explain my part, everyone will have a clearer picture of the situation. Lex looked at Raphael silently for a moment. Of the entire group, he was the one who gave Lex the most trouble. Even Noman's ability didn't put as much actual pressure on him. He did not at all behave like Lex expected. For a brief moment he wondered if someone had reincarnated in Raphael's body the way Mingjia had reincarnated in the mountain. But he dismissed the thought the moment it entered. If he started suspecting everyone he met of something so absurd, he himself would go insane. My source is fairly simple, Lex said lightly, as if it wasn't really such a big secret. Have you seen the Midnight News building? Well, if you've been inside you'd know that other than what they sell on the newsletter, you can also purchase additional information. This file is available there. Impossible, Raphael said, shaking his head. If news like this was being sold so openly, everyone would know about it. I haven't been to the news building, but I'm positive they wouldn't be selling such news. At least, it would not be so simple to get one's hands on it. Lex flashed Raphael an amused smile, and then eyed Noman. His meaning was clear. Noman had not mentioned he was lying, so clearly it meant it was the truth. Yet Lex did not mean to leave things at that. It was clear that everyone in the group had intentions of their own with the group. Anakin wanted to make money, Larry wanted revenge, and Raphael clearly wanted something too, though he didn't know what that was yet. Even Sutta must have had some other ideas, he was sure of it. But amongst them all, Lex was perhaps the person with the most to gain. Not only did he want to hire them at the inn if they showed potential, he was about to use them to link his multiple identities together. Well, of course, that's not the kind of stuff they sell to the public. That kind of news is only available to the inn staff. Like me. Lex summoned his Clark Kent glasses and put them on. Let me introduce myself again. My name is Leo, and I run the Gamers Denver. Chapter 479, Showing Off. Let me introduce myself again, said Lex, wearing a casual smile. But it was not his usual handsome face that wore the smile. Instead, the face appeared slightly more mature, with deep-set eyes and a jawline sharp enough to cut through steel. His voice also changed, becoming slightly heavier and lower. The faint glimmer of amusement in his eyes and the teasing tone in his voice matched his new persona well. The face he wore looked like it was on the verge of causing mischief at any given moment, but at the same time, presented a trustworthy and reliable facade. He looked like the kind of person who would be forgiven even if he caused trouble all the time, just because everyone knew he never meant any harm. Yet even if he did mean harm, what could anyone do anyway? My name is Leo, and I run the Gamers Denver. From the distracted Larry, to reclining Noman, to the slouching Anakin, to even the ever-proper Raphael, everyone in the room suddenly sat up straight as goosebumps covered their bodies. With wide eyes and chaotic minds, they looked at the man who was now sitting amongst them and tried to wrap their head around the news they had absorbed. It was not just a matter of Lex actually being an employee, which was mind-blowing enough. No, instead the shock was because not only was he a worker of the inn, he was the mysterious employee who had seemed to pop out of nowhere. A single worker appearing or disappearing, amongst the numerous that worked in the various areas of the inn, should not have been worthy of any interest. In fact, besides a few prominent workers, such as Z, who made regular appearances at the arena, most people did not know any of the workers. So then why was the reaction to Leo so strong? And why was he described as mysterious? It was because no one had heard of him, or the few that knew him had seen him so long ago, they forgot he even existed. Yet, one day, he suddenly popped up out of thin air, and as a foundation-level expert, single-handedly defeated over 300 nascent realm cultivators. This was not an insignificant accomplishment. In fact, Lex himself had no idea of the impact that single action had made. Earth alone was ruled by 5 nascents for decades. The entire planet and all its countries and armies were vassals of those 5 people. Yet Lex fought off over 300 of them at the same time. He did that while he was in the Foundation realm. Now, he sat amongst them as a newly reached Golden Core level expert. Not a single one of them took Lex's strength lightly, from the extremely strong Larry to the system wielder Suda, to the much experienced Raphael. There were simply no words to elaborate the insanity of the achievement properly. The fact that Larry fought Suzuki for days before being able to kill him spoke of the difficulty involved in a fight at a higher level. Yet Lex had taken a few hours, if at that. Access to news like that is just one of the perks that the inn's employees get. You'll understand if I maintain my silence about some other details relating to the inn. What's more important is that you understand that the information I got was directly from the inn's sources. Some time ago, I had Marlowe deliver the file to Fernanda. I had hoped that whoever was really behind all this would treat this matter seriously. After all, according to what I know, they were very particular about civilian casualties in cultivator matters. But either there is a holdup I'm not aware of, or they don't really care as much as I had expected for some reason, because no new action has been taken against the prisoners. At least as far as I know. This is not exactly an easy situation to investigate. Lex looked at the bewildered Larry and then at Raphael. He gave the fellow a teasing wink, but said nothing else. He had said his part, and now it was the other's turn to explain. Raphael took in a deep breath as countless thoughts ran through his mind. This Lex, or Leo, whoever he was, could be phenomenal help to his own cause in the future. A confident yet sly smile appeared on the man's face as he looked back at Lex. Well, your source is pretty good. I guess now it's time to tell you mine, he said, completely giving in to Lex's incessant goading. He wanted to show off his own secrets as well. But regardless of how impressive his own secrets were, just by wanting to show off, a chink in his previously impenetrable armor appeared. He was finally playing according to Lex's tune instead of maintaining his composed state. After all, the mere thought of wanting to show off would end up causing him to reveal a lot more than he might originally have planned to. The more he revealed, the more leverage Lex would gain. Actually, my source is fairly straightforward as well. My own memories are my source. You see, I am from the future, and I have already lived a very long time on Earth. It was only at the moment of my death that I was able to use a special treasure to travel back into my own body, so many years into the past. The previously confident Lex was startled and nearly fell off his chair as he looked up at Raphael in shock. Then he turned to Noman, expecting him to whisper something. Yet when he didn't, he looked back at Raphael with eyes wide. Raphael didn't show it, but internally he was greatly satisfied by Lex's reaction, and continued to elaborate. Actually, it's not so impressive. The future has already drastically changed for the entire Earth just because of a few minor changes that happened. But some things will not change no matter what happens on Earth. I'm not sure if you're aware of this or not, but the solar system is in a region called the Dead Zone. Dead zones are regions of space which suffer from a severe lack of spiritual energy. Yet in a few years, the dead zone in which the solar system exists will spontaneously undergo a change, bringing back spiritual energy in a flood. While that seems like a good thing, there is a prisoner being held on Earth that is akin to a goddess, known as Batet. Lex displayed an unusual expression at the mention of the name, but Raphael only assumed it was feedback at his news, further satisfying him secretly. With the return of spiritual energy, she will escape the prison. Such a thing is not really anyone's fault, but a few years later, that will cause problems too. But, what's more relevant to your question of how I know the Empire won't act against whoever rules on Earth, comes next. With the return of spiritual energy, the Earth entered what everyone assumed would be a prosperous era. But that couldn't be farther from the truth. While Earthlings enjoyed the abundant spiritual energy, what no one knew was that there were a number of alien races that had been dormant for God only knows how long on numerous planets, moons, and asteroids all across the dead zone. Raphael paused, and his previous smug appearance disappeared, replaced by a somber one. The first race we came across was called the locusts, at least by the Earthlings. It was not because they looked like insects, which they did. No, it was because they came like a calamity, blotting out the horizon with their vast numbers. Starved for hundreds of millennia probably, they ate anything and everything that contained spiritual energy, leaving nothing in their wake. And when I say everything, I mean everything. One by one, they devoured the planets in the solar system, starting from the furthest out. He paused again, lost in memory for a few moments. That was the first time I experienced hopelessness. They came from all directions, with the sun as their target. Any planet that stood in their way was nothing more than food. If they had come from a single direction, maybe we could have made a stand with the Earth as a battlefield to block them. But no, from all directions, as well as up and below, they swarmed, blotting out the stars in the sky. Fortunately, no matter how powerful they were, they could not cross the distance between the planets and the sun in a short time. That gave us just enough time, not only to wallow in our impending doom, but also to be saved. That was the first time I heard the name of the Jotun Empire, when their fleets suddenly appeared one day surrounding the planet, getting ready to eliminate the invading enemies. That was also when I learned that, the Earth, for thousands of years already, had been the private property of some noble family in the Jotun Empire. Raphael looked back at the bewildered Leo and took great pleasure in his surprised expression. How could he have known that while Leo had said not a single word, he had put on that entire display or surprise to entice Raphael to say more? In truth, Lex had long gotten used to encountering world-redefining things, so how could a little time travel take him by surprise? He also discovered another way to take advantage of Noman's ability and presence. Chapter 480 Uncertain Future. After a few moments of acting taken aback, Lex had recomposed himself. After all, overacting was a thing, so he couldn't act like he was surprised by everything. Or at least he had to pretend like he was trying to regain composure. A part of Raphael was disappointed to see him retreat behind his unreadable expression, but it was to be expected. I don't want to delve too deeply into the matter, but suffice to say, the Empire played a big role in how events progressed in the future. The battle was not an easy or a simple one, despite the advanced technology of the Empire, and lasted a few years. You may not be surprised to learn that many from Earth were conscripted into that war. We had the most to lose, after all. I don't know if the Empire couldn't send more forces our way, or just didn't think it was worth it. What I do know is that, after the war had been won, the Empire left much in the same manner they arrived, silently and without warning. They did not reform the planet, despite its severe mismanagement, the way they had done in the Vegas system. I suspect that had a lot to do with the nobles who owned the planet. But though the war was over, and the majority of the locusts had been killed, many had still survived. It was those remaining few locusts that became the bane of Earth's existence for the next few years, until, eventually, the next alien species that had been dormant finally revealed itself. Raphael closed his eyes and took a deep breath in. So many things happened back then, and since he was involved in all of them, he never really had the time or energy to think too deeply about them. So many things didn't make sense, and hinted at the fact that there were secrets hidden behind them. But even if he had realized those things back then, he was just a soldier, caught up in endless battles. How was he supposed to have discovered those secrets anyway? He reopened his eyes and looked at Lex. So you see, the Empire will not interfere, because Earth is already a part of the Empire. Moreover, I don't know how much of a role the owners of Earth play in allowing the prisoners to wreak havoc, but I definitely know that at least for a time, Earth will have to depend on them. So you want to just ignore whatever is happening on Earth for the sake of the future? Lex asked, his irritation evident in his voice. But he calmed down quickly, without Raphael even having to give a response. Some people may argue that Lex had weak morals, but that was far from the truth. He was just not an idealist, and he could see how antagonizing these people might be worse than just letting them be. After all, even if he became much stronger very quickly, it would not be to the level where he could protect the entire solar system depending only on himself, let alone the fact that Raphael said that there were other issues that Earth faced. Alright, even if we avoid challenging them, for now, it does not solve Larry's problem. We can't just ignore the very real threat to his life. These are things I have no prior knowledge of from my last life. All I can say is, hope that whoever your target is not too important. Or at least he is someone whose death can be accepted. Let's hope, said Lex blandly. He had no intention of relying on his luck anymore, so that was a terrible idea, but he wasn't going to argue with Raphael needlessly over it. And then what about the various problems you saw in the future? I get not wanting to share that you know the future with anyone. After all, I can see how anyone you tell might want to target you because of it, and there's no guarantee that anyone would even help. But if you tell me what other problems you foresaw, we might be able to work out solutions to them. Raphael shook his head, as if it was pointless. Too much of the future has changed, and too much is too sensitive to change. I can't be sure what problems might still happen, and I'm not sure what problems might change or become worse if I share information about them. I'm making preparations of my own, and keeping a close eye on all events. As soon as I can confirm the situation is heading down the path I recall, I can react, or share the information with you. But if I give you warnings, there's a very decent chance something you might do to prevent the situation makes it worse. On this, all any of you can do is trust me. Lex remained silent, and looked the other people in the eye one by one. None of them seemed too surprised by what they heard. It seemed they had already had this conversation with Raphael before. Well, that, and for Noman it made sense since he had no affiliation to Earth at all. That brings us back to Larry's issue. Ignoring everything else, we still don't know who the actual perpetrator is. If we can bring the prisoners to the inn, we can easily discover the truth using Noman, said Anakin. Easier said than done. One of the reasons it's been so hard to check if there have been any changes with the prisoners is because they've stopped coming to the inn. Their golden keys must have been withdrawn at some point. Alright, so we somehow deliver the keys to them, wait for them to escape from their prison to the inn, and then use Anakin to discover who is the person targeting Larry. Once we know that, back on Earth, we can take care of them. Or, if they're stupid enough, we challenge them on the murder grounds. To deliver the keys, we will need to know the location of the prisoners. I'm sure that's not so easy to discover, said Larry as he looked around the room. Even if we discover the location, it is surely being guarded and it won't be so easy to overcome. Let's take things one step at a time, said Lex. I'll try to see if I can learn where the prisoners are being held, and if it's possible to get a golden key to them. If I can't find a good solution, we can brainstorm a few other ideas. In the meantime, Raphael, why don't you go ask your dad to meet Fernanda and have an upfront conversation? Having a direct source of what their stance is will be much better for us than guessing on our own. Who knows, maybe she'll even be open to some negotiations. You want my dad to confront Fernanda? You know how that'll probably go, right? Lex just shrugged and said, not really. I'm tempted to say that he'll just go and fight her, but Marlowe is a king and an extremely successful businessman. If he didn't know how to maneuver difficult situations, he wouldn't have had much success in either field. Raphael shook his head, but said nothing. Is there anything else? Lex asked, taking off his glasses. It would be bad if Leo was seen exiting the chamber with everyone while Lex had been the one to enter with them. Say, hypothetically speaking, one wanted to become an employee of the inn. How would one go about doing that? Anakin asked in a seemingly very casual manner. Lex smiled, but did not immediately reply. He looked at everyone sitting in the room in their eyes, to try and gauge their interest. All of them seemed to be paying attention. You have to attract the inn's attention, in the right way. If the innkeeper sees potential in you, he might give you a platinum key which will allow you to take a test to see if you're worthy to work for the inn. You can try giving the mystery trial a go as well. Just to be clear, the trial won't get you hired, but there's a chance your performance might attract attention. I won't say any more than that. Learning potentially sensitive information might not be the best thing for you. No one asked any more questions about that, so it seemed like it was time for them to leave. Right before he got up, however, Lex looked at Raphael and said, "Since you're adamant about keeping the future hidden, I won't try to persuade you otherwise. But you should know, Baudet has already been a guest at the inn and, while I can't say for certain, I suspect she has already left the earth." Lex did not wait for Raphael to respond and just left. Raphael himself, though, was greatly startled, and even paled a bit. If Baudet had already left, that would seriously affect his plans for the future. After all, in his previous life, the treasure he got to travel back in time was something he got with her help. In this life, however, he seemed to possess it already inside his body. What was going on?